Hello. First of all, I just want to give a brief introduction of myself. My name is Maya Sullivan, and I will be your primary instructor for this course this semester. This course is Legal Issues in Higher Education in the Bethel University EDD program. And I am honored and privileged to be able to share with you all this semester. Supporting me is Dr. Jessica Daniels of Bethel's program as well. She will be involved to some degree and will provide support to this course, but most of the course support and instruction will be done by myself. So that is why you are seeing me today to give this brief introduction and also to talk a little bit about the first module, which talks about chapters 1 through 3 of our book. So you should have that book. And before I get started on the lecture, I do want to share just a little bit about myself. Just briefly, I am currently working at Metropolitan State University in Minneapolis, or excuse me, in St. Paul, Minnesota. Metro State, as it is affectionately referred to, is the only four-year university within the Mid-State system that is in the metropolitan Twin Cities area. There are multiple other universities in the state of Minnesota. The only other public four-year higher university that is in the metro area is the University of Minnesota. And all of the other universities in the metro area are private institutions such as Bethel. Penn State or Minnesota State Colleges and University System is one of the largest systems in the country. It serves over 400,000, actually, I think it's almost 450,000 students um, throughout the world, really, since we are globally connected. And for that reason, it is one of the top five in terms of quantity of students in the nation. A little bit about myself. As I said, I'm at Metro State. I'm serving there as a Dean of Students and Title IX coordinator. And within that role, I have responsibilities for multiple student success or student affairs areas. This includes our international student services, veteran services, student life and leadership development, and that also includes like all the student orgs, student association, commencement, new student orientation, TRIO programs. We've got both college and college access programs on our campus, women's and LGBTQ services, and our student parent and resource center and food pantry. I'm also responsible for student conduct, and as I mentioned, I'm the Title IX coordinator. And just general issues or concerns that might arise regarding students or concerns about students. Prior to Metro State, I was at another institution within the Mid-State system that was Minneapolis Community and Technical College. I was there for almost 7 years doing similar work, although I have more areas of responsibility here at Metro State. And in my work at Minneapolis and at Metro State, you'll hear me sharing different pieces of information as we talk a little bit about these first three chapters and throughout the semester. Prior to Minneapolis College, which is what the 2 year is affectionately referred to as now, I was actually practicing law. And I practiced law, I had my own practice for a number of years, and I also worked for other state agencies and the court system in the past. So in my practice, I mostly did anything from some education law, but I also did anything from criminal defense to civil rights law to family law, employment law, and many other different types of practice areas. I'm also a trained mediator, and so I am trained to provide and complete and conduct mediations with a few different methods of mediation. And so I do enjoy the opportunity to be able to um, do some conflict resolution without having to have a formal process, although there most definitely is often, in some cases, depending on the type of an issue it is, a need to have an actual formal process. So I am from Minnesota, from the Twin Cities area. I'm born and raised. I went to undergraduate in Nashville, Tennessee, at Tennessee State University, where I received my bachelor's degree, and went to law school here in Minnesota. I went to Hamline Law School, which, for those of you who may be local, you may know that Hamline Law School alone doesn't no longer exist. It is now Mitchell Hamline. So two law schools in St. Paul merged to create Mitchell Hamline Law School. So at any rate, and then many years later, I actually enrolled into Bethel's EDD program. And so I'm actually completing my program. I'm finished with my coursework, and I'm working on writing my dissertation. So I am in the same program that all of you are, although I've got about 20 or more years actually in the legal field, and more than 10 years doing some legal related work while I have worked in higher education. When I was at Minneapolis College, in addition to kind of the student affairs type of roles I mentioned, I was also serving as the deputy legal affairs director, deputy privacy official as well. So I had a lot of different responsibilities and hats that I wore. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about chapters 1 through 3, which are the chapters that are assigned for the first module. Chapters 1 through 3 kind of start off by setting some of the kind of just groundwork about the law and kind of how we got to where we are right now in the law. And so it talks about just the fact that the law kind of stretches across many different categories. The law is something that I think a lot of times people have a, for lack of a better word, maybe a misperception about what it is or what its purpose is. And so when you think about higher education and post-secondary education early on, when it was first getting started, things were very separate. There wasn't a whole lot of incorporating people who had legal experience and people who had a background in law or legal issues. It was very separate. And really, lawyers and the law were kind of seen as outsiders, even though you have to obviously go to school, at least now, in order to become an attorney or become a lawyer or to work in the field. It was still very much seen as kind of an outside profession, and in some ways almost like agitators for people who were in the law. So let's think about some ways that the law is involved in higher education. I'm sure that depending on what your roles are, if you are in higher education institutions or even K-12 or even not even in an educational institution, there are different types of policies or rules or laws or things that you can probably think of that apply. And so we'll talk a little bit about what some of the different types of laws might be, or things that just essentially guide the work that we do. Just kind of thinking as a big picture, when you think about higher ed in particular, we have any number of ways that we have regulations that would relate to this work. We've got things like the Student Code of Conduct. We've got federal policies and regulations that govern the things that we do. And so some of those things are things like the regulations that govern drug use on our campuses, Student Codes of Conduct, Title IX, which is a very massive body of regulation, which we'll talk some about this module, but a little bit more in the coming modules. But there's any number of regulations that impact what we do and the operation of a higher education institution. And so those are just kind of some basics, but we'll get to talking about more of those things as we go along. Some other things that we will talk about, though, are some of the differences between the different types of institutions. So, for example, you've got some public institutions, and then you've got the private institutions. And I shared about myself being employed within the MNSA system, which is most definitely a public a public system of colleges and universities here in Minnesota, and there are many, many systems throughout the country. The University of Minnesota actually is its own system, and then of course you probably know it's got multiple locations. University of Wisconsin is another one that has many different systems, excuse me, many different institutions throughout the state, um, as close to the metro area as River Falls. We've got many different systems throughout our country, but then thinking more globally, there's also many different systems within our global community as well. And again, same thing where there are some public institutions and there are some private institutions. So, the truth is that higher education has changed over time. Yeah, when we think about it historically, the people who had access to it were really the people who had money to be able to access it. And so over time, things have changed. Even the demographics of those who are pursuing higher education has changed. So there was a time where the majority of the people who were pursuing higher education were younger, who, once people got to be, around that 17, 18 years of age, when they were starting off on their own, where that was the majority of the people who were being educated through higher education. But then, kind of as you continue fast forwarding, various different societal things, particularly here in the United States, have caused the demographics of our student populations to change. So, we have, for example, more women who are attending school. And in fact, at current day, more women are in higher education institutions as students and attending and obtaining degrees and credentials than there are men. Where, of course, when education really started, when you think about the evolution, that most certainly was not the case. We've also had many other things that have caused the demographics to shift. We've had more immigration and increased immigration from certain countries. We've had a number of things related to civil rights. We've had changes in how we have disability accommodations for individuals. And we have a lot of these different types of things that have impacted education. Another area that is important to think about here is our veteran students or students who have previously served in the military. I don't remember if I mentioned veteran student services, but that actually is another area that I oversee in my role as Dean of Students. And so we had an emergence of individuals who had previously been in the military or served in active duty coming into higher education, and still that's the case. I can tell you right now, myself overseeing that particular area, what is going on, and what the busiest part of what's going on right now for students who receive benefits is, of course, that they are looking to have their benefits certified or recertified for a next semester. So while we have a certifying official for veteran students on our campus, and then we also have a coordinator for veteran students on our campus who kind of, they both serve as support for veterans, but they also have kind of different roles. That certifying official focusing mostly on the benefits, and then the coordinator really connecting that student to really any number of resources that they may be in need of. But all these kinds of things impacted how the demographics of our educational system has changed and shifted over time in the United States in particular, and even in a more global manner as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about governance in our higher education institutions. Again, we always have to go back to the different types of institutions because many times the type of institution does dictate what type of governance structure an institution may have. So, in a private institution such as Bethel or other private colleges or universities, oftentimes there are faculty senate or faculty associations that may be involved with some of the decision making, as well as providing some support and advocacy, for lack of a better term, for our faculty members who are on the campuses. And then some campuses also have similar things for staff members, so people who are not faculty, so people who do not teach on the campus. And then, of course, we have student government or student associations that do similar work on behalf of our students. At a public institution, we oftentimes might have those same types of groups as well, but because public institutions oftentimes are governed by state statute, but also collective bargaining agreements, they have those bargaining units, or for lack of better terminology, or not even lack of better terminology, but as how they are oftentimes known, unions. And so, for example, here in Minnesota, we have our public institutions all have are all unionized institutions, and so that means that everybody, with limited exception, is represented by some bargaining unit. So, faculty members in the universities are represented by the union referred to as the Interfaculty Association, or IFO, and faculty who are at our two-year institutions are represented by the bargaining unit called MSCF. But then staff members who are not faculty are either in what's called MAPE, which is the Minnesota Association of Professional Employees, or they could be part of MUSAF or ASF, which is the Association of Service Faculty. So technically they are faculty, they're service faculty, but they're not teaching faculty, so they're not treated the same, but they still have to go through the credentialing process in order to work in those roles. Then we also have AFSCME, which is typically going to be like your support staff. And then Middle Management Association is those individuals who usually are in middle management. Administrators, such as deans and above, typically are not in collective bargaining units, but they do have a contract that they have with the fact that they are in that particular category of administrator. So, interesting fact, when I was at Minneapolis College, including myself at the time, there were 4 separate bargaining units represented within the department that I oversaw when I last was working there. I was a member of Middle Management Association, or MMA, when I was there as a director and then an associate dean. But then I also had individuals from MSCF, I had MAPE individuals, and I also had AFSCME. So we were probably one of the most diverse units in that we had people from many different bargaining units. But that also means that a supervisor or a director or a leader in those areas has to familiarize themselves with those various contracts, because some things are similar and some things are not similar. Some things, could be as different as it relates to things like, particular days that are considered holidays for that particular contract. Some things could be specific to compensation, and then other things could be specific to processes for, say, bidding into another position, or layoffs, or things of that nature. So there can definitely be those differences when you're talking about the different types of contracts, but in particularly the different types of institutions that we're talking about. And so, quite oftentimes on our campuses, when we have public institutions, the faculty are often, well, really on any institution, the faculty are often a very strong voice. And there's often, a desire and interest in maintaining kind of a shared governance structure. And sometimes in our public institutions, the faculty voice, some people may say it seems like it's a much more significant voice, perhaps, than other individuals or staff members or employees on the campus. And I don't think that's the intention, but oftentimes that's the way that it appears to be. So again, just various different types of structures to be aware of as you are thinking about things throughout this module, but also throughout this semester, and even as you move on into your careers or further into your careers, just kind of having an idea of some of those differences. In a public institution, the primary kind of governance overall governance of the institution is, of course, going to be the state statutes or the state regulations that govern that institution. And then in a private institution, it may not necessarily be state statutes, although they oftentimes are also responsible for abiding by state statutes and things of that nature as well. But there also may be particular rules and policies that the institution has in place at private institutions as well as public institutions that are abided by in order to maintain order and structure within the institution. So let's talk a little bit about policy. So I talked a little bit about policy. I mentioned that in one of my roles, even before higher education, I actually served as a policy consultant for one of the state agencies. So I wasn't in higher ed at the time, but another state agency. I was a policy consultant. And so I was responsible for doing a lot of policy development, but also figuring out how best to modify policies, develop them, create them, and also to make sure that I helped individuals within the agency or related agencies understand the meaning of certain policies, the language of policies. So being able to apply those policies to particular situations. And within higher education, even when I was in my past roles and even current roles, I've served as the chair or co-chair of a policy development committee. And in my role at Metro State, I do serve on what's called the Policy and Procedure Committee. And so in both of those roles, it's given me the opportunity to be involved with one, reviewing policies as they come to light, but also developing policies or being part of the process to modify them. The book talks about a few different steps for things to consider when you are talking about policy development. It talks about identifying policies, and it talks about having a phase where you're drafting things and approving things, and it also talks about implementing them and kind of having an evaluation phase. And, one thing that I would say to keep in mind, particularly as we talk about developing a more inclusive environment where people can have the access that is needed in order to be successful in their education. And also, as we talk about being a more global environment, you know there are there is the importance to be considering and thinking about policies also in other ways. So not always thinking about them in terms of how things have always gone, but also thinking about those policies in a way in which you are looking at them through different lenses. And so one of the things that I started working on when I was at Minneapolis College in my role was how can we develop or utilize tools that will allow us to not just create new policies or tweak them or modify them so that they can, say what we need them to say, but how can we make sure that we are being inclusive in what we are saying? So maybe it makes complete sense to me, someone who was born here in the Twin Cities metro area, but maybe it doesn't make sense to someone who was even born in a different region of this country, much less someone who's never been here and is taking classes remotely or online and they currently live in Australia. And so trying to think through better ways to present those types of things to individuals with an inclusive lens is something that I would encourage you all to incorporate into that whole review process. If you are reviewing policies or if you are considering them, there are some great tools out there that allow you to consider the inclusive issues that you might want to make sure that you are considering as you are working through making your policies, creating them, redeveloping them, or developing them, as well as applying them in a particular situation. So let's talk a little bit about legal planning and dispute resolution. I'm going to just kind of hit on some of these different things because I do want you all to not have to have a very long lecture, but also have time to be able to do the work that kind of is coming in this module and the next module. But one thing I would want you to think through is that when you are talking about the types of uh, laws that might apply in a situation, usually you're going to have either federal regulations or state regulations. You're going to have your case law, and then you're going to have potential policies and things like those that I have mentioned. One thing to keep in mind when you're talking about a institution of higher education, but also other types of institutions, really, is this topic or this idea of agency. Your book talks about this, and in a nutshell, it essentially means that or says that an institution or an employer is responsible for the wrongdoings that their employee conducts. And however, with the law, there are always all these caveats, with the exception of, or, but in this case, those types of things. And so essentially, what it means is that they're talking about tortious acts, and a tort in the law is simply a civil wrong. And so it is the situation where you see, for example, a criminal case where maybe someone was killed, but then, a year later, the family sues that particular individual or their family or estate in a civil court. So now that is a civil court or a civil wrong, it is a tort. And so basically, agency is saying that the employer is responsible for those tortious acts or those civil wrongs that the person is committing. The caveat, really, though, is that it's supposed to be only applicable where you've got a situation where the employer, or excuse me, where the employee is doing something that really they were supposed to be doing within the scope of their employment. So, for example, let's say an employee is working at the institution in which you are working, or maybe you're supervising that particular employee at the institution in which you're working or you work for in the future. Let's say that employee is supposed to be going to a meeting in order to talk about some new program effort with another institution, and they have to drive from your campus to the other campus in order to get there. But let's say that employee, instead of going directly to that campus, decides that they're going to go to that meeting late, and they are going to go to the Mall of America in order to purchase a few items that they want to get because it's so close to Christmas and they haven't been able to finish their shopping. So they said, well, hey, it's a 3-hour meeting. I'll get to the meeting an hour late. I'll just stop here at the Mall of America and get it. And while they're at the Mall of America, they decide that, you know what, I realize that my paycheck is short. So I'm actually going to just take a couple of these earbuds that are on this stand over here. I'm going to put them in my pocket, and I'm going to walk out of the store. Later on, they're caught, and whatever criminal act ensues. So now the store does not probably have the right to then sue the institution and say, well, hey, your employee was on their way to this meeting because of their job, and so because of that, you are responsible for the fact that they stole this merchandise from our store. Most likely, that would not be seen as what would be the case, and the reason being because the employee essentially kind of stopped. They were en route to that particular facility in order to go to the meeting for work, but instead they essentially stopped or they discontinued their paths to get to that institution or that other school in order to have that meeting. And then they essentially deviated, did their own thing on their own. And then, of course, stealing is a wrong. So most likely your institution wouldn't be responsible for a situation like that or something like that happening. But let's say for some reason your institution was responsible. What type of consequences can flow from an institution being responsible for something that is a wrong that an employee of theirs has committed? there are any number of things. There could be monetary damages, which is typically what you see people looking for. Depending on the situation and what's going on, it could be that there's an injunction that's being requested or being issued. An injunction is essentially the court saying you have to stop doing this. You can't do this any longer. And if you do, you can potentially risk having some other kinds of consequence as a result of it. There could be situations where there are attorney's fees that are attached. And if there are attorney's fees attached, that could be something that's added or done individually. It could be that all of those things are happening at one time. So there's many different situations that could occur. Now, everything doesn't go to court. Some things might not be litigated in that way. There are times where you could resolve things with what's called alternative dispute resolution, or oftentimes just simply referred to as ADR. ADR, or which is a form of conflict resolution, is a more informal method of resolving an issue that might exist. It's not necessarily utilized for the most part in criminal law, but it is used in civil law in cases. In fact, in many court systems, you actually have to attempt to resolve the issue using some sort of ADR before you proceed with everything. The same thing in, say, family law. In many family law court systems, families have to go through basically an ADR. In Minnesota, they call it early neutral evaluation, or ENE, which is essentially saying like, hey, I'm going to sit down with this mediator or this alternative dispute resolution individual, and we're going to try and figure out the situation. And again, that's family law, that's civil law, both in Minnesota, but the civil law in most cases is in other states in the United States anyway. And so we've got mediation, which is one form of ADR, and then we've also got arbitration, another form of ADR. And sometimes there are those hybrid methods of doing it as well. Mediation is a method that oftentimes is a little less restrictive than arbitration in many ways. There are also multiple types of mediation. So, for example, there's facilitative mediation, there's transformative mediation, there's different types. Transformative tends to be the type where you are essentially putting a person in the shoes of the other person. And so, or at least that's what you're attempting to do. The goal is to make them have a better understanding of what that person's perspective is. And then arbitration oftentimes has a decision maker, whereas mediation doesn't even always have a decision maker. There's a mediator, but that person doesn't necessarily make a decision about what's going to happen. What they do is they help the individuals typically get to a decision on their own. And then they may write up some sort of an agreement based on what the two parties or the multiple parties have agreed. Versus arbitration, where you have an arbitrator typically who is based on what they've heard, almost kind of like a quasi-judge role, because they are making a decision. Now, some pros and cons are that, of course, some pros being that in either case, individuals are given a wider range of opportunity to participate in the process. But then on the other hand, it is a private process. So there's no public record of it in the same way that, like, if you were looking for a case 20 years from now, you might not really know that arbitration or that mediation had taken place. And so depending on, individual preference, that may or may not be something that someone is interested in doing. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk a little bit about trustees and board members at institutions in terms of their liability, or just their roles at our campuses and our institutions. They do have a level of authority that is afforded them, but their authority is typically limited to whatever they have been provided is what they have a right to do. So they're usually some sort of prescribed level of authority that they've been provided, or they've been told that they have these, 10 duties or responsibilities or things that they are allowed to do. Outside of that, they don't have the ability, or they are not entitled to do anything other than those things. And so when you do have a situation where a trustee is doing something outside of those things that they have been given authority to do, then that is something that can most definitely be problematic to people or in situations. So in a private institution, you have oftentimes not just the board policies and university policies, but you also might have, say, the articles of incorporation that the board members or the trustees might have to be considering. For public institutions, those boards are going to be governed by statute. So oftentimes what their responsibilities and obligations are set by statute, and they need to adhere to that statute. There are times where individuals may have concerns or file claims against the university. And in those cases, sometimes they may also file those claims against the board of trustees or the board that is involved. And occasionally, individuals file those claims also against the trustees in their individual capacity. So oftentimes you'll see a lawsuit, and it will see that it will say, John Smith in his individual capacity, or it will say in their professional and their individual capacity. And the reality is, of course, if you're you have a lawsuit for $10 million. Most likely, John Smith doesn't have $10 million, but quite often they might include individuals in those ways. So, all things to be thinking about if you are on boards, but also if you are in an institution that has a board or board of trustees that they kind of answer to. And then also the other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that administrators or others within institutions oftentimes have some liability of their own by virtue of their role. And then we've got systems in place in our institutions that sometimes govern these things. So we've got HR related policies and things like that. We also have student related things, co-curricular things. And so, for example, if a student were to get harmed or get hurt or injured, while they are doing something that is an activity of the institution, there could be some liability and responsibility on the part of administrators or the institution as a whole. However, in a situation, say, where a student decides that they're going to do something that has not necessarily been condoned by the institution or wasn't part of what they were supposed to be doing, they don't necessarily have a situation where the university is going to be responsible or an individual. So, for example, I'm reminded of a situation at one in my past institution where there was a student group that went on a trip. And of course, this is college students, so everyone is an adult. Well, the students went on a trip with a group, and I believe there were probably about 12 students who were part of this group, and their advisor and a couple of other staff members went on this trip. They went to Atlanta, Georgia, actually, for a conference. And so, at any rate, there was one particular student who, at one point, people hadn't seen for some time. And as time went on, people were checking in with them, and then the person who was rooming with that particular student said, "Well, I know that they have family members here in this area," and they mentioned that they were going to go and try and visit their family members. Well, a couple of days went by, and they hadn't been able to reach that particular student. Meanwhile, the student also hadn't been attending the conference that they were there to attend, which was the purpose for the trip. So finally, when it was time to head to the airport to depart and return to Minnesota, the student still had not showed up. The student didn't come to the airport. They called and called, and finally, when they got a hold of the student, they learned that the student was, in fact, with family. And so the problem is that they didn't actually get a hold of that student until they had a layover and they were no longer in that state. They were now in another state. And so essentially the student was still there in Georgia, and the group was gone because they didn't want to miss their flight. And so essentially nothing happened to that student, but had something happened to the student, the perspective here is that the school or the university or the institution is likely to not have had liability there. Why? Because the student went there to attend a conference that, in fact, the student, in fact, did not attend, essentially, and decided that they were going to do something completely different by going and spending time with their family members without being in contact with the institution. And so while, the school, was concerned and is concerned, of course, ultimately, most likely would not have had liability there. So, but just some things to be thinking about as you're going along in this module. Please go ahead, work on your forum, and make sure that you work on that influence paper. If you need to reach out to me, feel free to reach out to me and do that. And I look forward to spending the time with you all for the rest of this module, for the rest of the term, and hopefully beyond. Again, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to this class. And I pray definitely that this semester, this term is a good one for you, and it continues you on a successful trajectory as you pursue this education. Thank you all so much. Goodbye.